now like to turn it over to the final presenters for this afternoon to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Meehan. I'm a consultant with Milliman. We're an actuarial consulting firm, and I hail from their Boston office. For those of you that didn't realize that, you'll figure it out about 5 minutes into the presentation with my accent. To my right is Claire Bello,
Yes.
and she is with VCM, which is a division of CCMSI. And Claire's background, if you want to share it,
Sure.
by all means, sure.
In a prior life, I was a defense attorney. Don't hold it against me. But I did insurance defense work and coverage work for 15 years. And then about 15 years ago, I started VCM, which is a specialized medical malpractice TPA. We do national work, and we work almost exclusively with captive and self-insured programs, and we work exclusively with healthcare professionals in the professional lines. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I've been with Milliman approximately 25 years, and our office tends to specialize in the alternative risk financing market. So I've been very active in the self-insured and the captive markets since I started at Milliman over 20 years ago. When it was originally introduced, it was mentioned that we were the last session of the afternoon. Usually when we hear that, there's a big round of applause. So I was disappointed not to get that, but I think it'll be a standing ovation when we're finally done, and we may even finish up a couple of minutes early. So first, thank you all for joining us today. I know it's probably been a long afternoon for some of you, and we're what's keeping you from the bar. There's my Boston accent shining through. So without further ado, I'll get us going here. Today's topic is to discuss, IBNR, why do I have it, why is it necessary, and is there a cure? So, just to forewarn you, there are going to be some numbers in this presentation. Actuaries love numbers, so I felt compelled to include some in the presentation.
I'll poke at him to make sure he goes through them quickly.
I will do my very best, and I'm going to make it a point to stress right up front that the reason we have actuaries and the reason there's the need for IBNR is because Claire is always wrong. So, as a TPA, if they got their numbers right in the beginning, then there'd be no need for the actuaries to come in and estimate IBNR. Now, I say that in jest, and the reality is, the actuaries are the ones that are always wrong. And the misnomer here is that Claire's task as somebody who is a TPA in setting case reserves, their charge is to establish reserves based on the information known at a specific point in time. And that's really the difference here. That's the differentiating point. So a brief overview of the presentation. Reserve types. Everyone's familiar with IBNR reserves. If you aren't, the IBNR stands for incurred but not reported. I've heard it described as IBNE, which is incurred but not enough. So, and there's also the case reserve component. And so I'm basically going to walk you through the different components of ultimate loss. We'll talk about what is IBNR. I'm going to talk about how actuaries, some of the sort of basic, most common methods actuaries use to calculate and estimate IBNR, and why that need is there. And we're going to talk about some factors that can impact the calculation of IBNR. Why is that number higher for some organizations? Why is it lower for others? It certainly is impacted by the lines of coverage you're estimating. And Claire's group, the TPA involved, certainly has an impact on that as well. And then finally, is there a cure? I'll jump to the end right now. No, there's not. You're going to have it. You're going to need it. You're going to want it. And I guess in very few cases, you could argue that there may not be a need for it or a very small amount of it. But the reality is it's a necessary component on your balance sheets. So reserves, they're certainly the main liability on a captive's financials. Certainly if you get surplus on there, that's another large liability. But the reserve piece is certainly the largest component that folks are concerned with. The reserve types, we've got case reserves. Those are the reserves that we're talking about here in terms of your TPA. And I should have underlined it, but the key phrase up here, it's for facts known at the time. And that's the reason when I joked earlier that Claire is always wrong. She's not, the TPA is not, it's just because that's not their charge. They're trying to estimate the reserves of a claim based on the circumstances and the conditions of that claim at that point in time. And what the actuary's job is to do is to sort of identify and quantify how those claims, that book of claims, is going to change over time. We can break IBNR into two components. Really, there's bulk IBNR. That's the development on the known claims. That's where the claim is ultimately going to cost more than it was originally set at for case reserves. And then we've got pure IBNR, and that's where you've got the claims that haven't been reported yet, late reported claims. Typically, it shows up in the long-tail liability lines. Workers' comp, you could have an accident take place in December of an accident year, policy year, and it may not materialize or show up for 2, 3, 5 years later. And so the claim has been incurred, you just don't know about it yet. It also includes pipeline claims, so even if it's a physical damage sort of claim, it still may take 24, 48, sometimes 30 days to make it through the pipeline and find its way into your loss runs. And these reserves, the case reserves and IBNR, they're all subject to considerable uncertainty because, at the end of the day, we're really predicting the future, and nobody really knows what is going to happen in the future. The goal is to basically sort of minimize that delta around what our estimates are going to be and where the claims ultimately wind up. And also today, we'd love it to be as discussionary as we can. So if anybody has any questions, comments they want to add, please feel free to interrupt us, raise your hand, and we can make this as interactive as we possibly can. I know some of the actuarial slides may not be conducive to that, but I'd love to have some questions along the way, so please feel free to jump in. Components of ultimate loss, I think it's important to just have an understanding. Actuaries, we're basically estimating ultimate loss. We're not estimating IBNR reserves. That's really what falls out of the analysis. So if you start on the left-hand column here, the blue on the left-hand column, the bottom piece represents paid losses. So in this case, let's assume that ultimate losses are going to cost $100 or $100,000, whatever you want it to be. In this case here, we've got about $20 in paid losses as of a given point in time. The orange block represents case reserves at that point in time. And then the IBNR reserves, that's the amount that the actuaries come in and estimated, what you've seen in your year-end actuarial report. So those three combined, you add the three up, and you get $100 of ultimate loss for a given accident year. Well, paid and case reserves, some of you may already know this, but when you add the two together, that basically gives you case incurred losses. That's what, going across the chart, that's what the green column represents. And again, the IBNR sits on top. So the relationship's still the same. Paid plus case reserves plus IBNR equals ultimate loss. And as we go further across, now you can take your IBNR reserves and your case reserves, and you end up with that purple column. Paid losses will still remain paid losses, but that's really the sort of different ways you can break down your ultimate losses at any given point in time. Now, what's important to understand is that through the course of time, what we'd expect to happen is dollars are going to be shifting from the IBNR, the yellow block, into case reserves. So they're going to move their way down over time into the orange block, while simultaneously claims are going to be being paid. So the blue box is going to start to grow. So over time, the blue is going to grow, the yellow is going to shrink, and as claims ultimately get paid and the year closes out, the entire column would turn to blue. So everybody sort of understand how that works, the relationships between the three components, and if not, please feel free to speak up. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the more common methods that actuaries use to project ultimate losses. And the reason we project ultimate losses is because the three components of ultimate loss now, we've got paid, case reserves, and IBNR reserves. Well, two of them are known. The paid is a known. You know how much dollars went out the door to pay for claims. The case reserves have been estimated by your TPA. So if we can estimate ultimate losses, we can back into what the IBNR number is at any given point in time. So some of the more common methods, development methods, anybody who's seen an actuarial report, these are two methods that show up in just about every report, paid and case incurred development methods. We have expected loss ratio or loss rate. They're very similar methods. That's where an actuary is basically going to look at history and see what would be a good estimate for an entire book of business, an entire line of business for a given year. So, for instance, if you're going to write $1 million of premium, and we expect that line of business historically is operated at a 65% loss ratio, then we'd expect $650,000 in losses in that year. That would be our sort of initial expected loss amount. And we have a blend of those two. This has many names, but I think one of the most common and And the name that I think scares people the most, it's called the Bornhueter-Ferguson. We also call it the expected emergence method, and it's got a host of other names that show up in different reports, depending on the actuary that's signing the report. And that really operates as a blend between the two. We're going to talk about why an actuary might use some of these different methods, how they're actually used, and you'll see how the IBNR ultimately is calculated using these different methods. Loss development methods. So the important thing to remember in a loss development method is that the actuary is trying to use the company's own data. So for those of you who've seen an actuarial report, you see these sort of loss triangles. They can be somewhat intimidating, but the reality is it's just a compilation of data, of the company's own data at historical data points. So what the actuaries do is they triangulate data. We love numbers. We take as many as we can, and we generate these sort of loss triangles. And what that shows us, and I'll run through an example shortly, it shows us how the losses behave for an entity or a book of business over time, and allows us to run some of our sort of most common methods off of this triangle using the company's own loss experience to ultimately take the past to predict the future. And that's how we generate our ultimate loss selections, is using the company's own past, saying it's going to replicate itself in the future, using those sort of, the same sort of growth factors, if you will, applying that to information as of the latest evaluation date for the more recent years, and that tells us how, that generates an ultimate loss figure. I'll walk you through a calculation shortly, but the gist of it is we're going to compile these loss triangles. We're going to compile the age-to-age factors, and that's basically the relationship of losses, how they grow over time for a particular line of business. And then we're going to select some age-to-age factors. We're going to say, okay, we think that losses as of 12 months are going to grow by 20% in the next year, and that's the number we're going to select. And we continue that process out through time. We accumulate those factors, and if we accumulate what happens each 12 months, we can ultimately say where the claims are going to end up when they finally settle, an ultimate loss value. We take these factors, we multiply them times the loss data as of the latest evaluation date, and that gives us an ultimate loss value. So I'll put this into numbers. It's a little bit easier, I think, to understand this way. Here's the dreaded loss triangle that I think sometimes intimidates folks. But the reality is, an actuary sees this loss triangle, and this is a pretty stable one. As you might imagine, some lines, when you have a large book of business, you'd see sort of the law of large numbers takes hold. And you can predict with pretty good accuracy how claims are going to develop over time. Oftentimes we don't get triangles that look nice and clean and neat like this. The data is more staggered. You've got some years with zeros. You get lines of business with low frequency and high severity. This looks more like a liability line. We can see at different points in time the claims are growing. So for an example, in 2011, as of 12 months, there were $9,300,000 or so in incurred losses. We have developed the benefit of hindsight. We go 12 months later, so presumably 12/31/2012, and we clearly identified that Claire was wrong because that was case incurred losses of $9.3 million, but now the case incurred is $10.8. And again, the reality is the circumstances on those claims have changed. There's been new claims reported, so some of those claims we didn't know about as of 12 months. And also that there's been a change in conditions on a lot of those claims that Claire and her team have put case reserves on. And as a result, they've needed to adjust their case reserve amounts. So that's why we see this growth going across the chart over time. So using, again, the 2011 year as an example, we can see that the development is pretty significant early on. We go from $9.3 million to $10.8 million in the the second 12 months, and then it keeps growing over and over in time. Once we get out to age 60 months, 72 months, 5 and 6 years out, we've got a pretty good handle. You can see that the losses are developing at a much slower pace. Basically, it makes sense. You know more about the claims at that point. You've paid out presumably a high proportion of dollars relative to the ultimate value. There's less need for there to be reserve adjustments on claims because the circumstances on those claims aren't changing as much anymore because we know more about them. So using the 2011 year as sort of a blueprint, we're going to try and basically fill in the bottom of this triangle. That's what we're trying to do. We're going to try and figure out, well, we fast forward to 2016, and now we've got $16.5 million in incurred losses as of 12 months. Well, what's that going to grow to? So what we're going to do is look at the relationships of those dollar amounts over time. We're going to try and use the past to project the future. So I'll walk you through what that means. And as an example, now, if you keep for the 2011 year, the $10.8 million at 24 months and the $9.3 million at 12 months, keep those numbers in the back of your mind for just a moment.
Can I interject for just 1 second? This is really fascinating to me because we live the day-to-day. You know, we work with the clients, and every day we're looking at these cases saying, what is this case worth? Which is a little bit of a different question than what you're looking at here. But they all do tie together on the back end. And whether you handle your claims in-house or whether you use the TPA, it doesn't matter. The point is that in some jurisdictions, you're going to see that years 1, 2, and 3 are really low. And then years 4, 5, and 6 bounce because of the way the jurisdiction has discovery, the way the judges handle pretrial conferences, things like that. The same token is if you have an active early resolution program, you're going to see those numbers bump very early and then steady out throughout the course of the program. But the consistency in how you approach these cases is really the key to getting these numbers to not be quite so painful with the multipliers that you're going to see next.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Claire, because you're looking at things at basically a granular claim-by-claim level,
Right.
and the actuaries are coming in most likely taking a look at it from that 10,000 foot view. So this is an aggregation of all the claims going on, and we've aggregated the incurred losses on 100, 500,000 different claims, which the TPA has set individual case reserves on. A lot of the noise on a claim-by-claim basis is sort of washed out when you look at it on a combined basis. And to your point, depending on the jurisdictions and depending on the line of coverage, the IBNR necessary to support that book is going to be significantly different because if you're reacting earlier and bumping up those case reserves at an earlier point in time, the need for IBNR is going to be a lot less. Whereas if you've got a situation with a jurisdiction, you've got multiple years to sort of identify those claims, the IBNR number is going to be much higher. You know they're out there. So the IBNR is going to be a lot higher in that case, and you won't have as many case reserves established at that point.
For example, if you have an occurrence-based policy, you can have 2 or 3 year tail on claims coming back to these policy years.
So again, using that 10.8 and that 9.3 million for 2011, we're just going to look at the relationships, how the incurred losses develop over time. So this here is in any actuarial report, we typically summarize the data above, and then below we have these sort of age-to-age, we call them age-to-age loss development factors. So if you kept those numbers in mind from 2011, basically what that tells us is that the incurred amount went up by 16.2% from 12 months to 24 months. And similarly, if the rest of that triangle, all we're doing is taking one point in time, dividing it by the preceding point in time, and we're generating these age-to-age loss development factors. So in general, again, this is a very clean example, simplified example. Unfortunately, we don't get to see a lot of triangles that look like this. This is an actual client data, though. And basically, the actuary's job here is pretty simple. All the loss data here from 12 to 24 months, it looks as though, in general, this book of business tends to go up by around 16% each year. So what we've done is we calculate some averages, and then the actuary has to use some judgment and say, well, what do we think is going to happen for the latest year from 12 to 24 months? And we select, down the second to last row, 1.162. We use a similar sort of methodology for all subsequent 12-month points in time. So from 24 to 36 months, the numbers jump around a little bit more, but we're somewhere in the 2 to 3% range. The actuary selects 1.03. Same methodology following across the triangle, and you can see we've selected some averages that go all the way to the end. In this case here, just for simplicity, the last factor here we selected is a 1. That's the tail factor. That's, the actuary has nothing to go on at that point because you've got no history that goes out past that point in time. So I showed you that triangle went back for losses as far as 2011. Well, presumably they could still be growing at this point. So at year-end 2016, they could still be developing. Just for illustrative purposes, we selected a factor of 1 here for simplicity. But in theory, that tail factor could be something greater than 1 as well. The actuary at that point is starting to use some judgment. We may look at some industry statistics to see how typical books of business in that line of coverage develop over time. And so that may replace the number, that selection of 1 here. So you do not always see a tail of 1. You may in a property coverage, but in a liability coverage, you likely would not. Unless your program is extremely mature, 20, 25, 30 years. Maybe up to the 15-year mark, you may see a tail of 1 pretty consistently. So now, actually going back one more time, so now we can accumulate those factors because basically the selected row just takes us from one point in time to the next. So if I just took my simple incurred losses as of 12 months and multiplied it times the 1.162, I've now got losses as of 24 months. Because that's all I've done is I've taken it from one point in time and brought it to the next. But what we're trying to do is get to an ultimate value, where when all claims are closed, what's the final settlement value? So in order to do that, we need to accumulate. We need to take into account what happens over a period, a series of 12-month periods. So what we're going to do is accumulate those factors. And all we do is we start at the right and we multiply across. So the 1 times the 1.01 above becomes 1.01. We multiply that cumulative factor times 1.003, we get 1.004, so forth and so on. So what that tells us now is that in these factors, if we took incurred losses as of 12 months, we could multiply it times a factor of 1.215, and that's going to give us an ultimate loss estimate using the incurred development method. Because what we've done now, we've accounted for the growth across several 12-month accident periods. We multiply them together, and we end up with a cumulative factor. And that 20, so basically what we're saying is that if you give me incurred losses as of 12 months, they're going to grow by 21.5%, and at that point you'll have an ultimate value. So typically the triangle and the selection of factors is followed by the development method itself. So what you can see here is the actual reported losses as of 12/31/16. So this would be the latest diagonal on that triangle. So you've got the 16.5 million for 2016 in the bottom. On that triangle, the number on the farthest right piece of that triangle for 2011 was 11.2 million. Now we have those factors that we accumulated. If you recall, the 21.5% is what we said would happen to take losses as of 12 months and develop them to ultimate. So if we multiply our case incurred losses as of 12/31/16 times these accumulated factors, that gives us an estimate of ultimate loss. This is just one estimate using one method. The actuaries are typically going to run a number of methods, including some of those that I mentioned earlier on in the presentation. We've got actual paid losses. That's just data. We know what that is. That gives us our total reserves, ultimate losses minus paid losses. If you recall from those bar charts earlier, that gives us our total loss reserve amount. Well, again, now we know what case reserves are because that's a given, that's a fact provided by the TPA. And if we subtract the two, total reserves minus case reserves, that gives us our IBNR figure. So here we've got paid losses of 65 million, case reserves of 22 million in the bottom, and we're giving IBNR reserves, we're estimating that in this one method to be about $4.6 million. Any questions? Okay. So just taking a step back now, so we did this example using case incurred losses. This method can be done using paid losses as well, just paid losses. So in that case there, we've got a triangle made up of just paid losses, and the same sort of methodology takes place. We're going to look at the age-to-age factors, we're going to make some selections, we're going to accumulate them, and we're going to run a similar method here. So let's see here. Let's talk about the comparison of the methods now. So there's some pros and cons to each one. The pro for the paid is that you're actually looking at hard data. It's not so it can't be manipulated. Once you pay a claim, the dollars are out the door, and you can track that. So it's not subject to sort of judgment or other estimates. If you look at the development method using incurred dollars, you've already factored a little bit of uncertainty in there because you've got a TPA making estimates for case reserves. And then we're making estimates off of estimates. So there is, one of the pros for paid is that, once you get a bill in for a claim, or once a lawsuit is settled, or once you receive a doctor's or a lawyer's invoice, those are dollars out the door. You can track those. Those are real dollars. There's no sort of judgment being, that could sort of influence the outcome. But at the same time, the reason to use the incurred was that you're using all available information. Your TPA is saying, well, I know the conditions on this book of claims, and we do think that the case reserve should be X. So that's often a valuable piece of information that you may want to include. And that's why you'll typically see the actuary run both methods, both the paid and the incurred development methods. One of the cons of the method, I think it's important to recognize that it's very mechanical. You're looking at history, you're taking a factor, you're multiplying it times data, and there's my answer. What you lose in that, or it's very easily influenced by sort of unique circumstances. What do I mean by that? Well, if you are, say, a workers' comp program, or it's a liability program, and you have that, 1 in a 10-year claim, it's catastrophic, it happens early on, it happened, maybe it's a bus accident, it's some complex claim, it's going to cost you a lot of money. Maybe not be full limits, but maybe it's $250,000 or $500,000, and it shows up in your loss triangle early. Typically your book, those claims sort of develop and evolve over time. Sometimes you have those rare occasions where that claim is known right away, and you put that number on the books pretty quickly. So typically that $250,000 claim may start at 25 and grow to 250 over the course of 5, 7, 10 years, but sometimes that 250 shows up right away. And if it does, and you use the simple development method, you're multiplying, you're probably going to overstate the answer. And the reason for that is you're now just taking a loss development factor and you're multiplying it times this claim, which typically doesn't show up for years, and it showed up really early. And you're not expecting that same developments on that claim. So if you've got a factor of 1.215 for an incurred basis, and your claim's $250,000, you're basically putting on another $50,000 of IBNR on that individual claim when it's likely not necessary.
The other thing that basing the analysis on the paids concerns me as a claims manager is that when the laws change, these numbers don't reflect those soft considerations. And I call them soft just because they're sort of subjective based on where you are and what program you have. You also have some sovereign immunity issues, and if that goes away, then those claims are going to look wildly differently than they do today. So, the other thing too that I find, we do a lot of trending and tracking for patient safety and risk management purposes for our programs. You find when you have a C-suite change, you're going to see something totally different in your reserves and your numbers because the piles may be handled completely differently than they used to be. So the hard paid numbers concern me only from the standpoint of what we paid 5 years ago or 7 years ago, 8 years ago isn't necessarily going to drive what we're paying tomorrow on these claims.
Yep. And that's one of the challenges the actuaries face, is sort of incorporating these industry changes, if you will, that aren't necessarily going to replicate themselves in the future. That's really, that's where the actuarial work becomes more art than science. Jumping ahead, the expected loss ratio, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's going to show up when we run through the Bornhueter-Ferguson quickly. But basically what we're doing, as I mentioned earlier, if your company's writing $1 million in premium, you select the loss ratio, likely either based on your historical experience, or you're basing it, selecting it based on how the industry typically performs, how we see other similar programs, lines of coverage, how they're going to behave. You often use it when you've got no historical information. So if you don't have the ability to create those loss triangles, it may be a method that the actuary is going to employ. Now getting into the Bornhueter-Ferguson, you'll see that the triangle is identical to what you saw for the incurred loss development. The only change here is now we've added on the IBNR factor. So once you've selected your loss development factors and you've accumulated them, there's a simple algebraic calculation you can use. It's 1 minus 1 over your factor, and that's really an IBNR factor, and that's what shows up in the Bornhueter-Ferguson method. I won't bore you with too many details in that, but I'm going to jump to the next slide where you can actually see this in practice. So the Bornhueter-Ferguson, as I mentioned earlier, it's really a blend of the expected loss methods and the development methods. And the reason I say that is you're starting with initial expectation of loss. So in this case here, same block of data, but now we've introduced premium into the equation. So for these books of business, or for this line of business, we've got earned premium by year. We've selected an expected loss ratio of 65%. So that gives us our initial expected losses for each accident year. Now we have an IBNR factor. So at any given point in time, we have an expectation of how much IBNR there should be based on our initial expectation of loss. So for instance, if we have an expectation of $100 of ultimate loss, after 12 months, we may think that you need $25, 25% of that's going to show up as IBNR. We can calculate that based on the selected incurred development factors, as I showed you a slide ago. So we have now this IBNR factor. So what this tells us is that as of 12 months, in the bottom of that column 5 there, we expect that 17.7% of losses have not been reported yet as of 12 months for this line of coverage. That's that 1 minus 1 over the factor of 1.215 I showed you. So if we have an initial expectation of about $25 million of loss for that year, that tells us that IBNR for that year should be about $4.4 million. And again, similar to the development methods, we can take those factors by year and run the same sort of calculation. So we have our initial expectation of losses, we have an IBNR factor, and that gives us our estimate of IBNR as of a given point in time. And now this is where it becomes a blend, because we're going to take what we know as of this given point in time, your actual incurred losses, we're going to add in our IBNR, and again, using that chart earlier, we have sort of the relationship between paid case reserves and IBNR reserves. If we add in IBNR to our incurred losses, again, we get ultimate losses. So this is really, another tool in the toolbox that the actuaries have at their disposal. Similar to the development methods, the actuaries will often run this on both a paid and an incurred basis. When you're running it on paid data, it's no longer an IBNR factor, it's an unpaid factor. But the same sort of transition takes place. Now you're estimating unpaid losses. If you add in paid losses, you've got ultimate losses. I'm going to jump ahead here now. So the pros on this, similar to the development methods, or I guess different from the development methods, it's not going to overreact to a single large loss that's recognized early in your development patterns. It's going to sort of mitigate that because we're focusing on our initial expectation of loss. We're not just going to multiply a factor times a claim that's been incurred and shows up in your triangles early on. We're not going to overstate it. We're taking a blend now, utilizing those factors, but also keeping in mind that we have this initial expectation of losses, and that hasn't changed. But how those losses come in over time, that's the variable. The cons, again, now as in the development methods, you're relying on development factors from the past. So, the big variable here is the past representative? Is it reflective of the future? And as Claire's already alluded to, there are circumstances where that's not the case. So the actuary's judgment, we may need to revisit the expected loss calculation. We may need to reselect loss development factors based on changes in the industry or changes in reserve setting practices. And we're going to touch on that a little bit very, very shortly. I think
In
this
fact,
is
we're going to
where-
touch on
there
it
we
right
go.
now. Okay, so I have to tell you, when I came into this industry 15 years ago, IBNR, triangulations, Greek, But one of the things that I think is really important to remember, when you are in a captive program, you've become an insurance company. And so while you are insuring yourself and you're insuring your own people, you have to start to think like an insurance company. And as I said before, it doesn't matter whether you handle your claims in-house, it doesn't matter whether you use a TPA. But there needs to be an absolute reserving philosophy that is developed for your program. And you have to apply it consistently across time. Otherwise, his numbers are going to do this. And I think the hardest thing to remember is when you're looking at the individual cases that you're handling is that there is an effect. There's a far-reaching effect. If you decide to change TPAs, if there's a C-suite change, if you hire someone new who's going to be the director of claims, if you decide to go from an in-house to a TPA or from a TPA to an in-house program, All of these things are going to change your reserve philosophy, because as soon as you change who's at the driving seat in setting those reserve or making those reserve recommendations, everything from that is going to change. And that's a conversation that has to happen with the actuaries. And I think my message today on the consistent reserving is you can really kind of have any reserve philosophy that makes sense for your program. I have some programs who set a zero indemnity reserve until they're done with their investigation and they feel that they have a meaningful indemnity reserve to put on the file. I walked in as a consultant and I went, oh, that's terrible. It's not terrible. They've been doing it for 20 years. If I suddenly made them start setting reserves within those first 90 days, their actuarial numbers would have gone off the charts. So you have to kind of put into context what works for your independent program. For new programs, it's hard to set those large reserves. When you have, you're banking on the fact when you start your captive that you're not going to have a really bad claim in the first 3 years. You're banking on it because you need the premiums to build up before you set aside reserves. And 50-50, flip a coin, it does happen, and it happens more often than you think in the first year. So you may knowingly decide that you're not going to set that initial reserve in the first year because you need the premiums to grow over time. But ultimately, you want to have a consistent reserve philosophy that is applied for the most part in the same way on your files. So if you have a C-suite change, if you decide to change how you're handling the claims, if you hire new defense counsel, if you institute an early resolution program, that's going to shift your reserves to the front end very quickly. And that's not a bad thing, it's just a shift. But you don't want the actuary to go, well, we're starting from here and we're going to grow over the next 5 years in terms of reserves on these cases. So connecting those dots between what we're doing every day on the claims and what it can do to the captive's financials, I think is the hardest bridge to cross for a lot of captives. I know with me, it took a bit for me to learn that what I'm doing over here has a long-reaching effect over here.
And I think I would add to that, Claire, is in your example where that one client wasn't setting reserves until they had done all the sort of investigative work. And,
right.
A situation like that, because those numbers aren't showing up in the loss history, they're not showing up in those triangles that we went through a short time ago, that's a situation where you're going to find a much higher IBNR figure than in a company that's recognized and put up case reserves earlier in time. I told Claire, she alluded to it, it's important to have that sort of consistent reserving philosophy. And you could give us the worst, TPA, worst case reserve person in the world. And that's okay, as long as they do it as long as they're consistently bad. We can account for consistently bad. The key word in that is being consistent. Right. To that point, that's one philosophy where they weren't putting reserves up. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that as long as it's done consistently, we can account for that. It's going to show up in the loss triangles. It's going to show up in your development history. And as long as it repeats itself, that's what we're banking on. And it's when it's not going to repeat itself, when those changes are made, when the challenges become real for us.
I think the other thing, too, that I would caution is, a lot of times when we meet with the boards for the captives, they want to know what the ultimate reserve is on a case. I avoid the word ultimate with a passion, mainly because I am always wrong, because we are only looking at a particular point in time on these files. I can tell you that I can tell you what a resolution reserve would look like. I can tell you what I think this case is worth to settle. I can tell you what I think the ultimate worst case scenario might be at the time of trial. But again, when you go to trial and you pick a jury, flip a coin. We might put a $2 million number on it. They may come back with 12. So these are things that are unexpected. And I think that it's important to remember that. It's also important to remember, I think, personally, one of the best reserving philosophies is to sort of have a 3-stage process to the valuing of your files. And the first one is the initial, and we base it on the severity of what's being claimed at the time and what we know. The second is to create a resolution reserve process where we say, if we were to get rid of this case today, what are we willing to pay to make this case go away? The answer is 0. Great. Let's set an expense reserve and we defend it. But if the answer is, well, I'd pay them $50,000 to go away and they might take $60,000, now we're in a realm where that might make sense instead of paying defense counsel $75 to settle it at $60 at the time of trial. So these are the reserve considerations I think need to be made. And then if you decide that it's not going to resolve, then you want to set a trial reserve. Then you're looking at your worst case scenario potentials for the reserve. But as you'll find out on Thursday, reserving is part science and part art, and it's a difficult thing to do. You also have to talk with your captive board to find out what percentage they want their case reserves to be. Do they want it at 65%? Do they want it at 75%? If we're pretty accurate in those reserves on the case reserve side, then the IBNR can come down a little bit. So can you cure it? No. Can you control it? Yeah, you can. And your spike cases will always be something that need to be taken into consideration. I will also say avoid reserve spikes. Our rule of thumb, try really, 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 really hard not to change your reserves within 90 days of settling a case, unless you do it all the time. These spikes spike your numbers, and excess carriers don't like it, reinsurers don't like it, your actuaries don't really like it, and it becomes something that we need to explain in the financials for the captive. So, setting a smooth reserve course, I think, is probably your best practice. And the last one is consistent litigation management. It sounds pretty simple, but when we're talking about IBNR and you're talking about expenses and losses, you're also talking about what it's costing you to defend the files. And litigation management becomes very important. We all love defense attorneys. I do too. I was one. I believe that they are a vital part of what it is that we do. But they have to have rules, and they have to follow the rules. And that's something that is a fine line between, depending on your defense counsel, and managing the expenses of your cases. But when you manage those expenses and you manage a smooth reserve process, then your confidence level for reserving goes up and your IBNR can go down.
Jump ahead, and I think we've got about 5 minutes left here. Yeah, I think a fair amount of this slide's been covered.
Yep.
But,
again, changing TPAs, personnel, philosophies, all of these things can affect your reserving and your actuarial numbers. To me, these are not things that you don't do. These are things that just require a conversation so that as the analysis is being performed, people can take into consideration what's being changed.
Yeah, I think, to that point, the communication is certainly a key component to all of this. When changes are going to be made, any sort of change in personnel, change in reserving philosophy, it's important to communicate that to the actuary because, again, now it doesn't necessarily make sense to use that past to predict the future, and we don't want to either over or underestimate the reserve numbers. It doesn't benefit anybody to do that. So, right. And we have tools in the toolbox to sort of handle those situations as well. I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts of those today, but the reality is that discussion we can sort of help quantify how or what adjustments we need to make on our end. And I'm going to briefly mention one of the methods, but for the most part, having that discussion does help us, make that help to quantify what impacts we need or what changes we need to make as we're making our estimate, change our estimates. Yes, sir.
So you both highlighted the importance of consistency and the impact of external factors. And I see up there you've got changes in the law as one of those things that need to be analyzed. Any observations on where there's been meaningful changes in tort reform in states, whether it's caps on non-economic damages, whether it's some of the things happening in Florida right now? Do you have to wait for the data to show up before you make some adjustment? How do you look at that?
That's a great question, and I'll speak this one to you. But you
So,
want to start? Okay.
in general, we've been asked to repeat the question. In the essence of your question is, when there's a change in the law, how long does it take in a particular state, in a particular program to see the difference in the data? Is that correct? Texas is a great example of tort reform. California's had them for so many years that they're steady. But when California passed the constitutional amendment to impose the tort reform, we saw it almost immediately. The claim counts dropped, defense fees dropped, the verdicts dropped. So you probably had about an 18-month lead before you started to see it in the data.
And I think honestly, oftentimes when these sort of major overhauls take place, if you take, workers' comp, changes in workers' comp programs by state, typically there's an impact study that's going to go with that and what the expectation is, how that's going to impact claims going forward. So we sort of evaluate that on a case-by-case basis, but we're also looking to see what industry sources to help quantify those changes, and we're trying to incorporate that into our analysis.
Yeah. And we've seen the flip side too. In New York, we've had some decisions that, for example, extended the statute of limitations for certain cancer patients. That's going to significantly change the way we reserve files because they're going to last longer, and they're probably going to cost more to defend.
I think there's a
Yes,
couple
sir.
of questions.
So similarly, if you're talking about a bad number, that a spike, for example, in your actuarial projections, how many years does that take to work its way out on the IBNR, the development time?
Okay, so you're talking about sort of a single claim that's come in?
Say the program is pretty steady, but then has a spike every so often.
Yep, so if it's a spike related to a single or a handful of claims, we can make an adjustment for that immediately. We can sort of, we can have, a claims consultant go in and take a look at those claims and sort of look at those separately and then develop the rest of the book as we normally would. If you're talking about, the TPA decided on a whim, this year I'm going to reserve claims at a much higher level, that's a little bit more challenging for us, particularly if it wasn't communicated to us. We have had issues where, there's been an issue where one of our TPA or the claims handler for an organization, it was a SIG, went out on medical leave. So they had somebody else come in and handle things for, I think it was about 9 months. It was pretty interesting to see the change in the data, and we could actually point to it, and saying this is what we saw in those 9 months. So we were aware of that change. We ended up having to do a separate analysis to have our claims person go in and sort of dig into a file by file, and sort of we could line things up and say, well, this is how it would have been, or we can make changes in our factor selections, or we may rely on methods for our initial expectation of loss in that case. So there's different things we can do to account for it, but again, it comes back to the communication. If we didn't know that and we just saw a spike, we'd say, okay, well, they're having a bad year, and it wasn't attributable to a single or a handful of claims, the whole book seems to be up. And we typically ask a question, so hopefully the response would be, no, it wouldn't be, everything's fine. We get a response that, hey, Joe is out on leave, medical leave, somebody else is doing it. That's the reason for the spike. And that, as long as we have sort of an explanation, we can, make the attempt to quantify what that impact's going to be. Okay. Another question? Sure.
You're often here not to stair-step reserves. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. The question was, you often hear don't stair-step reserves, and what does that mean? It means different things, whether it's indemnity and expense. I'll hit indemnity first and very quickly because I think we're out of time. But from an indemnity standpoint, you don't want to see those reserves going up every quarter from an indemnity perspective. You really want to see a thoughtful evaluation of this is what we think the case is worth today for this phase of the life of the case. And that's why I avoid that ultimate reserve factor, because you may have a doctor who tanks on a deposition a year and a half into the case, which requires a reserve adjustment. That is not stair-stepping reserves. Stair-stepping reserves is if you are consistently every quarter, and we've seen some of these clients where we'll make recommendations for the reserves and they say no, or they'll say, okay, we'll increase it by 5,000, we'll increase it by 10,000. That's what you don't want to see. The same thing is true on the expense side, and it's much harder to be proactive in the reserving on the expense side, but a lot of programs use the expenses almost like a checkbook. They'll increase those reserves just enough to pay the expenses for that quarter or that month. And that's really stair-stepping the reserves too. So but on the other hand, if you're looking at expense reserves and you say, I don't know if this is a case, we're going to try, mediate, I don't know, it's too new. But I know on average it takes us $30,000 to close the pleadings and start discovery in this particular jurisdiction. That's the reserve I recommend. And then when we get closer to the end of discovery or the beginning of discovery, then you go, you know what, this is a case we don't think we have any liability. Now I'm going to put $75,000 on it to see if I can get through discovery. So those are not stair-stepping. Those are evolving. But it's that 5,000, those small chunks, that's the stair-stepping.
I'm going to jump ahead. I think we've covered just about all of the remaining slides, but just Sort of circling back to really the main premise of today's discussion, and I think, IBNR, it's not curable. Companies, you need it. I guess the reality is it's going to vary by organization, and it's impacted by the lines of coverage you're insuring. It's impacted, as Claire referenced, the reserving philosophy that your organization has. And if you're recognizing or case reserving claims to a higher or a final settlement value more early in the process, your IBNR number is going to go down. If you're recognizing it at a later point in time, then your IBNR is going to be higher. But at the end of the day, I call it a necessary evil. I don't think it's evil, but I think, just to be on par with some of the comments we hear about IBNR, it is a necessary component on your balance sheet. So, are there any further questions? If not, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.